Have you ever wanted to capture those breathtaking long exposure shots but didn't know where to start? In this step-by-step guide, I'll break it down for you so you can easily create stunning images, even if you're just starting out as a beginner. G'day friends, long exposure photography creates some of the most powerful and timeless images you'll ever see. It's a technique adored by professionals, and many beginners dedicate hours, days, or even years trying to perfect it. As someone who's been in the field for years, I've got good news for you. Capturing great long exposure shots is easier than it looks. Even if you're a beginner, you can achieve really good results straight away. Keep in mind, it does require more skill as you go along, but this video will get you started with the right gear and the settings you need to get the nice images that you want straight away, so let's go. So let's start by explaining briefly what long exposure is and how it works. Long exposure photography is a technique where you capture an image over an extended period of time by setting a slow shutter speed, whether it's 10 seconds, 30 seconds, or even minutes or hours. You can transform moving subjects into beautiful blurs while keeping stationary objects nice and sharp. Like in this photo here, you can see the rocks are nice and sharp, but everything else was moving while the shutter was open, so the water and sky became blurry. To simplify it, if you do a 2-minute exposure, that means that the shutter is open for that amount of time. So everything in that photo, like sky and water or cars or anything like that, moving constantly in that 2 minutes will cause them to create a nice blur in the image. If you take the same photo but with a fast shutter speed, you can see the difference. I took this shot while I was waiting for the light to drop, and it's a 1-second exposure. The sky is normal and you can see that the water is only starting to get a blur on it. The faster the shutter speed, the smaller the amount of time the shutter is open. So if you shot with a 500th of a second shutter speed, the waves in the sky would be frozen in place and sharp. But with long exposure, you slow things down, so making the waves appear as a soft, weird, cotton-like mist. The longer you keep the shutter open, the more the moving elements tend to blur. To get the best results, it's important to select a scene that combines both moving and still objects. The balance on this is the key. For instance, this 30-second exposure shot of the cityscape in Melbourne from a few years ago, the water was flowing, and that was great, and that became nice and silky smooth, but there were no clouds in the sky, which made the sky really boring. You can of course swap out the sky in Photoshop, but I like to get as much in camera as I possibly can. Now let's talk about gear, and you will be surprised about how much you don't need. You can do long exposure photography with a smartphone or pretty much any DSLR camera. I use a Canon DSLR, but as long as you can shoot wide-ish, you can get the job done. Most smartphones have a wide-angle lens now for this type of thing, so you can use them. You will need a phone that has a pro setting, and you may be limited to shorter exposure times, so keep that in mind. But let's just assume for this video that you have a DSLR with an interchangeable lens. A lot of people say you need a wide angle lens, and I do use one. Mine is a 17mm to 40mm zoom lens, so basically the lower the number, the wider the field of view is. The widest mine shoots at is at 17mm. But you won't always shoot fully wide like that. This shot of a jetty in Port Fairy was shot at 23mm, and it was a 7-minute exposure at f20 and ISO 100. I shot this at about 11 o'clock at night. Also, if you want me to do a tutorial on how I edited these images, let me know in the comments below and I'll get it done for you. And this one of the coastline in a town called Malakuta, Australia, was shot at 29mm. It was a 3-minute exposure at f22 and ISO 100. So what I'm saying is, if you have a 24 to 105 lens, then use that. If you have a 28mm lens, then use that. You will still get great shots regardless, and don't worry, I'll explain all the settings in a minute. The next item you'll need, and the most important besides your camera and lens, is a tripod. I use this one from Manfrotto, but just get yourself a tripod that's lightweight and extends to your eye level at full height. And you have to use a tripod for long exposure photography because your camera can't be moved while it's taking a photo. If you do move it, it'll blur the whole image. And as I said, make sure it's lightweight but sturdy, because you will be carrying it for a while when you're looking for that perfect shot. And that's it on what gear you need to get started. Keep in mind, you can only shoot long exposures in low light, mostly at dawn or at dusk with this setup. If you want to get long exposure shots during sunny days, then you'll need an ND filter, which stands for neutral density filter. And what it basically does is it sits on the front of your lens to darken it down to let less light through to your sensor, and tricks your camera into thinking it's kind of like nighttime. Kind of like sunglasses for your camera. Now these can be very expensive, as the brighter the day, the darker the ND filter needs to be, and the darker the ND filter is, the more it costs. A good place to start is a variable ND filter, and they're a bit cheaper, and that will work well enough on overcast days but not in full sun. This shot of a waterfall was done using an ND filter, a variable one, at 2 p.m. during the day. I'll put a link to one in the description along with any other gear that I talk about here in case you're interested. But if you're shooting at dusk or dawn, you won't need this to get started. Now you've got your gear sorted, you're going to need to scout for a location that you want to photograph. When I'm looking for a location to shoot, I get there an hour or two before sunset, and I walk around and work out my angles and set up my gear and just hang out with my friends and just get everything organised so I know what I'm going to do when the sun sets. That way when the sun does start to go down, I'm ready to go. Alright, so let's get to the shooting part. Once I'm in position, I'll set my focus on an object that isn't moving, like a rock or a lighthouse or something like that. And I'll start by switching my camera to manual mode, and I'll set the ISO to its lowest number. And in my case, the ISO is set to ISO 100 because that's the lowest that Canon will go to. Make sure you also set a 2-second timer as well, because if you just press the button without it, you can get a little camera shake which will blur your image slightly. The timer allows the camera just to settle before the shutter goes off. Next, I'll choose an appropriate aperture or f-stop if you like, to somewhere between f8 and f11. And that means that everything that isn't moving in the photograph will remain sharp. I'll set my shutter speed to around 1/30th or 1/50th of a second, then I fire off a test shot. If the image is too dark, I'll slow my shutter speed down, and the lower the number, the slower it is. On a Canon, I just rotate the wheel to the left to slow it down. If it's too bright, I'll turn it to the right to speed it up. And this is pretty much the only thing you'll touch on your camera settings for this type of photography when you're starting out. As the light fades when shooting at dusk, you'll need to keep slowing your shutter speed down until it hits the maximum of a 30-second exposure. If you want to shoot longer than that, like in the image here, and this was a 3-minute exposure, then you'll need to flick your camera onto a bulb mode. And how you do that is by the dial on top, and depending on what camera you have, you can set an exposure time like 2 minutes, for example. That means when you press the button, the shutter will be taking a photo for 2 whole minutes. So don't touch or bump your camera in that time, otherwise you'll blur your whole image. And here's another couple of tips. If you're on a beach, use your body as a windbreak so the wind doesn't move your camera and blur your image. Also flip your screen in. If you've got a flip out screen, make sure you flip it in too, so it doesn't catch the wind either. And of course, bring plenty of batteries, because if you're doing long exposures, you'll chew them up. Once I'm satisfied with the shot I've taken, I'll move on to the next position that I had mapped out earlier when I was scouting, so I can get the most out of the shoot for the day. And of course, the darker it gets, the longer that you need to have that shutter open. So just keep making exposures longer by about a minute each time as a starting point. Alright, places where you can use long exposure photography. Well, you can use them in light trails like this one. This shot was actually an accident. I set up my shot, it was about a 30-second exposure, and at about the 20-second mark, a truck just went past and ruined my photo. All the lines in the image are the truck lights as they were moving. I was pretty irritated at the time, but I ended up liking this image more than the one I took straight after it. Sometimes you just get a happy accident. Yay! And that was shot at f22, ISO 100 and 50mm. The reason I shot this at f22 and not at f8 or f11 is because at f22 you get a starburst effect in the lights instead of a dull glow like you normally get. You can see more in this image of the bridge. All the lights have got like a starburst kind of effect. And it was shot with similar settings. And you can use this on stationary objects too, like in this pier shot. It was midnight, it was overcast, so really the only light I had was from the lights of the pier. Once I edited it and changed it to black and white, this photo just came alive for me, and it's one of my favourite photos. You can also use long exposures in car photography like this one, which was shot at dusk. It's a 30-second exposure, shot at f13 because I didn't want starburst lights for this, but I did want the lights to be frozen a little bit and get rid of that haze. The ISO was 100 with the lens at 19mm. And this shot was done completely in camera, and that car was traveling at about 3 kilometers per hour. If you want me to do a video on how I got that shot and how I edited it, let me know in the comments below. Other places to shoot long exposure landscapes is city skylines and star trails when you're camping, and campfires. It's pretty much endless really. With the right gear and some creativity, you can elevate your photos to something amazing. It's all about finding that perfect balance between stillness and motion, blur and sharpness to create images that truly leave a lasting impression. Which is why I've made a list right here of 12 essential things a beginner needs when starting out in photography. Click on that now, and I'll see you over there. Thanks for watching.